Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to kind of flip the script on that classic attitude drives behavior idea.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're diving into something called self-perception theory.
Now that's an interesting one.
It really is. It
Yeah.
suggests that, sometimes we actually figure out our own attitudes and beliefs just by watching what we do.
Especially when we're not really sure how we feel to begin with.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you've given me a whole stack of academic journals and research papers all about this.
Should be fun to unpack all of that.
It will. So we're going to break it all down, give our listeners a clear picture of this whole self-perception theory thing.
Sounds good.
We'll trace it back to its origins, look at the research, and then see how it actually plays out in the real world.
By the end, everyone listening should have a really solid grasp of what self-perception theory is all about and how it can apply to, well, pretty much anything.
All right, so self-perception theory, what is it? Well, it basically says that we kind of figure out our own attitudes and beliefs by observing our own behavior, especially, like you said, when we're not sure how we feel.
Like imagine you're at a party and someone offers you this new kind of sushi. You're kind of hesitant, not sure if you'll like it.
Yeah, but you take a bite anyway.
You take a bite and then another, and before you know it, you've polished off the whole roll.
So self-perception theory says you then probably think, I must actually like this sushi just because you ate the whole thing.
Yeah. Even though you started out unsure, your actions sort of gave you the answer.
It's almost like we're looking at ourselves from the outside in, and then we use our own actions to figure out what's going on inside, right?
Exactly. It kind of flips that traditional idea that attitudes always come before behavior.
This reminds me of something you mentioned before we started recording about cognitive dissonance theory.
Oh, right.
Didn't someone propose self-perception theory as a different way to explain some of the same things?
Yeah, Daryl Bem, back in 1967.
Okay.
Both theories are about how attitudes change, but they come at it from different angles.
How so?
Well, cognitive dissonance is all about resolving that inner conflict, when what we do clashes with what we believe. Self-perception theory kicks in when our attitudes are kind of fuzzy or weak to begin with, and we figure them out by looking at our own actions.
So it's not about fixing a clash. It's more like filling in the blanks when we don't have a strong sense of what we believe.
Exactly.
But how do we know this theory actually holds water, out in the real world?
Well, that's where the research comes in. There have been tons of studies that back up self-perception theory and show how well it predicts and explains what people do in all sorts of situations.
Let's get into some of those studies then. One that pops into my mind is, I think it was called the cartoon experiment.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
So in this experiment, researchers were trying to see if they could influence how funny people thought cartoons were just by messing with their behavior.
Well, not just their behavior, but also by making them think they were either being truthful or lying.
Ooh, tricky. How do they do that?
Colored lights.
Colored lights.
Yeah, they had participants learn to link one color with truth-telling and another color with lying. Then they had them rate how funny cartoons were while they were looking at one of the colored lights.
So they were basically trying to see if those colored lights and those ideas of truth and lies would actually change how funny people thought the cartoons were.
Exactly.
And did it work?
It did. The people who said a cartoon was funny while seeing the truth light later rated it as even funnier than those who saw the lie light, even though they were all watching the same cartoons.
Whoa, so it was like their brains were going,
Well, I said it was funny when I felt like I was being truthful, so it must actually be funny.
that's the idea. And that wasn't just a one-off finding. Another study, the false confession experiment, looked at how self-perception could even mess with our memories.
Okay, now this one sounds like it could get really interesting.
They had people do these really simple tasks, like crossing out words on a list, and then later they were told to either confess to crossing out a certain word or deny it even if they were lying. So they were making them confess to things they didn't actually do.
Right, and again, they use those truth-telling and lying conditions, kind of like in the cartoon experiment.
So what happened? Did those fake confessions actually stick in people's minds?
What they found was pretty wild. Making a false confession while under those truth-telling conditions actually led people to remember things differently. They started believing their own lies just because the situation made them feel credible.
Wow, that's both amazing and a little scary.
Right.
It really shows how powerful self-perception can be. It can shape not just what we think and feel, but even our memories of the past.
It really makes you wonder how much of what we believe is actually based on how we feel inside versus how we understand our own actions.
Big questions to think about. These early experiments were really important for understanding how self-perception works, And I think in the next part of our deep dive, we should get into some real-world examples and see how this theory is being used to influence everything from what we buy to how we act around other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good to me. We'll be back after a short.
Oh, we can just keep going.
Oh, right. No need to stop now. Let's jump right into those real-world applications.
One case study I found really interesting comes from the world of retail. It has to do with the problem of food waste.
Oh, food waste. That's a big one.
It is. Researchers have been looking at what they call the ugly produce dilemma.
Ugly produce.
Yeah, you know how perfectly good fruits and veggies often get tossed aside just because they don't look, well, perfect.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of picking the prettier produce myself.
Well, most of us are. But here's the thing. The researchers found that people often see less value in that ugly produce because, believe it or not, it affects how they see themselves.
Really? How so?
Just imagining themselves eating those imperfect foods actually led them to have more negative self-perceptions.
So it's like we're associating the flaws in the produce with flaws in ourselves.
Right. It's kind of wild to think that our self-image can be influenced by something like a misshapen apple or a wonky carrot.
It is. And it has real consequences. All that wasted food contributes to a huge environmental problem. Did the researchers find any solutions, though?
They did. They found that giving shoppers a little self-esteem boost could make them way more likely to pick those less than perfect fruits and veggies.
Interesting. So if we feel good about ourselves, we're less likely to project those negative judgments onto the food.
Yeah, it's like a positive self-image can spill over into our choices.
So how did they boost people's self-esteem? Were they like handing out compliments in the produce aisle or something?
Not quite. They used these really subtle techniques like putting up signs with messages that focused on positive traits or reminded people of their accomplishments.
Oh, clever. So they were trying to create this positive self-context that would then influence people's produce choices.
Exactly. It's a cool example of how you can nudge people toward making more sustainable decisions just by subtly shifting their self-perceptions.
That is really cool. What other real-world applications did you come across in the research?
Another really interesting one was about heterosocial anxiety, which is basically feeling shy or awkward around people of the opposite sex.
Oh, social anxiety. I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to that.
Yeah, definitely. So this study was all about using self-perception theory to help people overcome that kind of anxiety.
Okay, how did they do that?
They basically guided shy individuals to have positive interactions with people of the opposite sex in this really structured and supportive environment.
So kind of like creating a safe space to practice social skills.
Yeah, exactly.
Did it work?
It did. As they started having these positive experiences, their self-perceptions started to shift. They started to see themselves as more confident and comfortable in those situations, and that started to become their new reality.
It's like that saying, fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
By acting confident, you eventually start to believe it.
Right. And as their self-perceptions changed, their anxiety levels dropped too. They reported feeling way less anxious and more comfortable in social situations, even outside of that structured setting.
That's really encouraging.
It is.
It's like we can actually use our actions to change how we feel inside, not just the other way around.
Exactly.
So we've seen how self-perception theory can influence our choices as consumers, how it can help reduce waste, and even how it can help people overcome social anxiety. Where does the research go from here? What else do we need to figure out about this whole thing?
There's still a lot to learn. Even though self-perception theory is widely accepted and used, there are still plenty of unanswered questions.
Like what?
Well, one big area is how self-perception interacts with all those other psychological processes we've talked about, like motivation, emotion, social influence. It's complicated. Figuring out how all those pieces fit together is going to be key to getting an even deeper understanding of how self-perception shapes our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This has been a really insightful look at self-perception theory so far. We've gone from its basic definition to those early studies to all these real-world examples, and it's clear this theory is way more than just a lab experiment.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely something that affects us all in our everyday lives.
It gives us this powerful new way to understand ourselves and see how the things we do can actually shape what we believe.
I agree. And there's still more to discover. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll take an even closer look at where self-perception theory stands today, talk about what future research might look like, and really get into the bigger implications of this whole idea.
Sounds great. Can't wait for that. We'll be right back after a quick.
Just kidding. Let's keep rolling.
Right, of course. No need to stop now. We're on a roll. So where were we? Ah, yes. Digging deeper into the current state of self-perception theory and what the future might hold.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to unpack here. What are some of the key areas researchers are really focused on right now? Well, one exciting area is how self-protection works together with other things that go on in our minds. We've touched on it a bit, but it's really complex.
You mentioned motivation, emotion, and social influence. Can you give us a little more detail on how those might intertwine with self-perception?
Sure. Let's take motivation, for example. The traditional way of thinking is that our motivations are what drive our actions, right? But self-perception theory brings in this idea that maybe, sometimes, it's the other way around.
So you're saying it might not always be, I'm motivated, therefore I act, but rather I act, therefore I must be motivated.
Precisely. And that has some pretty big implications for how we understand things like chasing our goals, forming habits, even personal growth.
It's like we can actually motivate ourselves just by behaving in ways that line up with what we want to achieve.
That's the idea. And it connects to emotions, too. Our feelings can definitely influence what we do, but self-perception theory says what we do can also influence how we feel.
Makes sense. Think about that classic advice, smile, even when you're feeling down. Sometimes, just the act of smiling, even if it feels forced, can actually make us feel a little bit better.
Yeah, it's like our bodies are catching up to the signals our actions are sending.
So where does social influence come in?
Well, social influence is huge. It shapes our behavior in so many ways. But self-perception theory suggests that we might also use our own actions in social situations to figure out what we think and believe about groups, norms, even ourselves compared to others.
So if we find ourselves going along with a certain social rule, even if we weren't really aware of it before, we might start to believe we actually support that rule.
That's right. It's like we're using our own behavior as clues to figure out our social identities and beliefs.
It all points to this much more dynamic picture of human behavior than we usually imagine. It's not just a one-way street from our inner world to our actions.
Well,
There's this constant back and forth between what we do and what we believe.
I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly what makes self-perception theory so valuable for understanding ourselves and how we fit into the world.
But with all this complexity, aren't
Right.
there some challenges in studying and using this theory?
Of course. One of the trickiest things is figuring out how much of our behavior is actually due to self-perception and how much is due to all those other factors we talked about, motivation, emotion, what other people are doing.
Right. It's a lot to untangle.
It is. It takes really well-designed studies and some fancy analytical techniques to separate out all those influences.
And what about the ethics of using this theory? We've seen how it can be used for good things like encouraging people to make more sustainable choices or helping them overcome anxiety.
Right.
But are there also some potential downsides?
That's a really important point. Like any psychological theory, there's always the risk that it could be misused. For example, you could imagine marketers using self-perception theory to manipulate people into buying things they don't really need or want.
Or even political campaigns using it to sway voters without them even realizing it?
Exactly. It's a reminder that knowledge can be a double-edged sword. We have to be really careful about how this theory is applied and make sure it's used ethically and responsibly.
Absolutely. And that's why continued research and critical thinking are so crucial. We can't just accept things at face value. We need to keep exploring the nuances of self-perception, its limitations, and its potential for both positive and negative impact.
I agree.
It's a fascinating field, and it has so many implications. So where do you see this research going in the future? What are the big questions that still need to be answered?
Well, one area that's ripe for exploration is how technology is shaping our self-perceptions.
Technology, huh?
Yeah. Think about it with social media, virtual reality, AI. We're interacting with the world in these increasingly mediated ways. So how are these technologies changing how we see ourselves, our relationships, even our realities?
That's a great point. We're bombarded with these carefully curated images, filtered experiences, feedback loops. It can definitely warp our self-image.
It can. It's crucial to understand how these digital spaces are shaping who we are and how we see the world.
For sure. And beyond the digital world, I think there's a real need to start applying self-perception theory to some of the bigger issues facing society.
Right.
I mean, we've seen how it can promote things like sustainable choices.
Right.
But what about using it to foster things like empathy, reduce prejudice, encourage people to act in more helpful and caring ways?
It's exciting to think about how we could use this theory to build a fairer, more compassionate world.
It is. It's about bridging the gap between research and real-world action, taking those theoretical insights and turning them into practical strategies that can actually make a difference in people's lives.
I agree completely.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from those foundational principles of self-perception theory to all its complex connections with other things going on in our minds, to its potential for good and bad, and then all these exciting directions for the future. It's clear that this concept is a powerful way to look at ourselves, our choices, and how we impact the world.
I couldn't agree more. As we wrap up this part of our exploration, I'm just struck by how incredible the human mind is, its complexity and its ability to adapt.
Me too. And I'm really interested to hear what you've taken away from all this research as we head into the final part of our deep dive.
So we were talking about how self-perception interacts with all those other fascinating things going on in our minds.
Right, like motivation and emotion and how other people influence us.
Exactly. And it gets really complex when you start trying to figure out how they all work together.
Yeah, it's not just a simple, this causes that kind of situation.
Not at all. Take motivation as an example. We usually think that we're motivated to do something and then we do it. But self-perception theory throws a bit of a curveball in there.
How so?
It suggests that sometimes we might actually figure out how motivated we are after we've already done the thing.
So it's not always, I'm motivated so I act, but it could be, I acted so I must be motivated.
Exactly. It's almost like we're looking back at our actions and using them as clues to figure out our own internal states.
That's fascinating. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about ourselves is actually based on those kinds of inferences.
It really does, and it has big implications for all sorts of things, like setting goals, forming habits, even personal growth.
It's like we can actually motivate ourselves just by acting in ways that align with what we want to achieve.
Right, and that ties into emotion, too. Our feelings can definitely influence our behavior, but our behavior can also influence our feelings. Think about it. If you force yourself to smile even when you're feeling down, you might actually start to feel a little bit better.
Yeah, there's something to that. It's like our bodies are trying to catch up with the signals our actions are sending.
Exactly. And then there's social influence. We all know that the people around us can have a huge impact on what we do, but self-perception theory adds another layer to that.
Oh, how so?
It suggests that we might also look at our own behavior in social situations and use that to figure out what we really think and believe about things like social groups, norms, even ourselves in relation to other people.
So if we find ourselves conforming to a certain social norm, even if we weren't really aware of it before, we might start to believe that we actually support that norm.
That's the idea. It's like we're constantly gathering data from our own actions and using it to update our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Wow, so it's this incredibly dynamic process where our actions and our beliefs are constantly shaping each other.
Exactly. It's not just a one-way street from our internal states to our behavior. It's a much more complex and fascinating interplay.
It really makes you appreciate the power of self-perception.
Mm.
But with all this complexity, it must be pretty challenging to study and apply this theory, right?
It definitely has its challenges. One of the
Yeah.
biggest is trying to isolate the effects of self-perception from all the other factors that can influence our behavior. As we've been discussing, there's motivation, emotion, social influence. It's a lot to untangle.
Right. It's not like you can just put someone in a lab and control for every single variable.
Exactly. It takes really carefully designed studies and some pretty sophisticated analytical techniques to tease apart all those different influences.
And what about the ethical implications of applying this theory? I mean, we've seen how it can be used to encourage positive behaviors like making sustainable choices or overcoming social anxiety, but are there also potential downsides?
That's a really important consideration. Like any psychological theory, self-perception theory can be misused. For example, imagine marketers using it to subtly manipulate consumers into buying things they don't really need. Or think about political campaigns using it to influence voters without them even realizing it.
It's a bit unsettling to think about how this knowledge could be used to manipulate people.
It is. That's why it's so important to have open discussions about the ethical implications of this research and to make sure that it's applied responsibly.
So where do you see this research going in the future? What are some of the big questions that still need to be answered?
Well, one area that's particularly interesting to me is the role of technology in shaping our self-perceptions. With the rise of social media, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence, we're interacting with the world in increasingly mediated ways. How are these technologies impacting how we see ourselves, our relationships, and even our realities?
That's a great point. It's like we're constantly bombarded with carefully curated images, filtered experiences, and feedback loops that can distort our self-image.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand how these digital spaces are influencing who we are and how we see the world.
And beyond the digital world, I think there's a real need to start thinking about how we can apply self-perception theory to address some of the bigger challenges facing society today.
Absolutely. We've talked about how it can be used to promote sustainable choices, but what about using it to foster empathy, reduce prejudice, or encourage more pro-social behavior on a larger scale?
It's exciting to think about how we could use this knowledge to create a more just and compassionate world.
It is. It's about bridging the gap between research and real-world action, taking those theoretical insights and turning them into practical strategies that can actually make a difference in people's lives.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of self-perception theory, but it's already given us so much to think about.
I agree. It's a fascinating area of research, and it has the potential to change how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
I can't wait to hear your final thoughts and conclusions as we move into the last part of our deep dive.
So we've really been digging into self-perception theory.
We have, from those early studies with cartoons and those false confessions to how it plays out in everyday life, like buying groceries or dealing with social anxiety. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And, as we've been talking, it really challenges how we think about our own minds.
It does. We tend to assume that, our attitudes and beliefs are what drive our actions.
Yeah, the classic, I think, therefore I am.
But self-perception theory says, well, maybe not always.
Right. It says sometimes it's the other way around sometimes. What we do actually shapes what we believe.
It's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
It is. It doesn't mean that our inner thoughts and feelings aren't important,
Right.
but it acknowledges that what we do plays a big role in how those thoughts and feelings develop and change over time.
So are you saying if we want to change our attitudes or beliefs about something, we can actually start by changing our behavior?
That's one of the most exciting possibilities that self-perception theory offers.
It's almost like a mind hack.
It is, in a way. By acting in line with the values or beliefs we want to have, we can nudge our minds in that direction.
Like we're sending signals back to ourselves.
Exactly. If I'm doing this, I must believe in it.
I like that.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not some magic solution, right?
No, definitely not. Real change takes time and effort.
Yeah.
And there are tons of other factors involved, but self-perception theory gives us this really useful tool for understanding how our actions contribute to who we are and who we want to become.
It's a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but in a good way.
I love that analogy. And it highlights how powerful this knowledge can be for making positive changes, both for ourselves and for the world around us.
It really is inspiring. We've already talked about how self-perception theory can encourage things like sustainable choices or help people overcome social anxiety.
Right.
But what are some other applications that you think are particularly promising?
Well, one area that has huge potential is education.
Oh, education. Interesting. In what way?
Imagine classrooms where students are encouraged to really engage with the material, to try different things, to learn by doing, instead of just passively listening.
That sounds a lot more fun than most classrooms I've been in.
Right, it would be way more dynamic and engaging. And the cool thing is, by getting involved in that way, students wouldn't just be learning facts and figures.
What else would they be learning?
They'd be shaping their attitudes and beliefs about learning itself.
Oh, right.
They might start to see themselves as capable learners, as problem solvers, as critical thinkers, and that could have a massive impact on their motivation and how well they do in the future.
It's like building a growth mindset, but through action instead of just words.
Exactly. And it's not limited to classrooms either. Think about workplaces where people are encouraged to take initiative, experiment, learn from their mistakes.
It sounds like a great environment to work in.
It is. It's a recipe for innovation and growth, both for individuals and for organizations.
I like it.
And self-perception theory provides the framework for understanding why this approach is so effective. By creating environments that encourage action and self-discovery, we can build cultures of learning, growth, and positive change.
That's a really powerful vision for the future. As we wrap up this deep dive into self-perception theory, I'm really struck by how relevant it is to so many aspects of our lives.
I agree.
It's about understanding how our minds work, how we shape our own identities, and how we can use this knowledge to make a real difference in the world.
Well said. Self-perception theory isn't just some academic concept. It's a tool that can help us understand ourselves, make better choices, and realize our full potential.
Thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey. It's been truly eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and inspired you to think about how your actions shape who you are and who you want to be.
That's it for this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.